One of the most barbaric concentration camps of the Second World War was Stutthof, found in Gdansk. But on one day, a year after the war had come to an end, there were a series of executions where the guards of the site got their comeuppance. But these executions were not like most that had been carried out in the aftermath of the conflict, as they were not performed in the privacy of a prison. The Americans tended to condemn their war criminals inside of Landsberg prison, on the gallows there, and the trapdoor here opened hundreds of times post-war. But the former guards of Stutthof were executed in public, in the same manner that thousands of people had in the centuries before. Public executions were seen during the medieval and Tudor period in England as huge public spectacles, and the Polish officials on the 4th of July 1946 certainly wanted this to happen. One by one, many female guards were executed first, but they were condemned on a structure which was specially built for this occasion, and the instrument of death was no other than a huge gallows structure that stood high above 200,000 people who witnessed these executions. Welcome to The Untold Past. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. The gallows that stood high above on Biskupia Gorka Hill were rather different in their construction. These were built especially for the executions of the guards of Stutthof, and the intention for this was to ensure that everyone in the city nearby could see that justice was being administered following the war. These were criminals who were responsible for death, slaughter and horrendous crimes inside of the local concentration camp, and many were years before, like those men and women who witnessed the proceedings, everyday people who were lured into working inside of one of the Third Reich's death factories. The gallows were 5 different sets of gallows, all made of course from wood. The central gallows that stood in the middle of the structures was slightly different. This featured 2 different beams coming down, which created a gallows where 3 hooks were attached on the top, leading to 3 people being able to be condemned on this gallows at once. All of the other 4 structures had one single piece of wood going up, and on these 2 people could be executed. They were incredibly high and were made to make a statement, allowing a crowd of up to 200,000 people to be able to see without any difficulty as the condemned were executed high up in the air. From the rings at the top of the structure, the noose could then be attached through this. It appears also that the gallows were surrounded by sand, presumably to soak up the blood from the executions or excrement as the noose tightened. What made the Biskupia Gorka Stutthof executions also different was that the executioners themselves were the very prisoners of the very camp where the guards worked. These were men and women who had seen much terror and lived under this for many years, and they wore their striped uniforms, some did, and they were the ones who secured the noose in an act of retribution. The gallows were so tall that a different variation of the usual execution procedure was developed. With this, a number of vans were procured for the executions to almost act as a scaffold. The former guards were led onto the back of these vehicles, and they were helped up by the officials who were stood on them, including the executioner, and someone there who was there to read the death sentence. Experienced hangmen stood by also, to make sure that everything went well. Whilst on the van, the vehicle was backed up under the gallows, and then the noose was passed through the ring on the gallows, and the noose was then secured and tied around the neck of the condemned. When the signal was given that everything was in order, and when the crowd were reminded of the crimes of these men and women, someone knocked on the van's cab, instructing the driver to slowly move off. With this, the condemned, with the noose around their necks, were then left on the gallows hanging, and these executions did not necessarily include a drop, meaning that the sole intention was for these people, these guards of Stutthof, to be strangled to death. They had the life literally strangled and choked out of them, and within minutes the kicking and struggling would be over, as their bodies went limp and lifeless. Of those executed on the gallows on the 4th of July 1946, there were 5 women. These were Jenny Wanda Barkmann, a woman known as the Beautiful Spectre, who was also known for selecting prisoners to be sent to the gas chambers inside of Stutthof. She was a woman who was not remorseful at all for her crimes, and she spent more time at her trial flirting with the guards and caring more for her hair. Elizabeth Becker, von der Klaff, Eva Paredes, and Gerda Steinhoff all also worked at Stutthof, and they were known for their sadistic behaviour and for also sending prisoners to the gas chambers. It was customary during executions at the time to allow women to be executed first, and for them to then succumb to their fate, and Jenny Wanda Barkmann was the first condemned that day. The women were executed together on the gallows, and the men were then executed on the other structures next to them. The men executed were Johann Pauls, Tadeusz Kobzinski, Kozlowski, Józef Reiner, Franciszek Sobczynski, and Jan Brajst. The majority of these men were prisoner functionaries, those who were actually imprisoned, and were known as capos. But these men were given some form of power to wield over others, and they often got carried away with their attacks. Some capos at the end of the war were even turned upon by the liberated prisoners and were slaughtered themselves. One thing to consider is that the executions that occurred and the public hangings of the guards of Stutthof were actually opposed by members of the Polish clergy who found this sort of execution barbaric, wrong, and a step in the wrong direction and too far. They tried to stop this happening, but it was like a carnival on the hill, and there was an atmosphere of almost like a fun fair. Some locals even opened up food stalls, and they sold ice cream for the public to eat, almost as if they were at the cinema watching a movie, but instead they were actually spectating the execution and deaths of human beings, no matter how beastly they were, and it was like the medieval period. The executions using slow hanging was for the entertainment and for public spectacle, especially as other guards, who were later condemned, were executed using the gallows inside of a local prison. It was said that also slow strangling was literally that, and it could last up to 20 minutes until someone was killed, and the condemned were all hanged in succession, one after the other, at 12-minute intervals, meaning that each of the condemned, after Jenny Wanda Barkmann, had an agonising wait, knowing what would soon be coming for them. They were also forced to witness the executions of the fellow former guards, which must have also been rather traumatic. The gallows of Biskupia Gorka Hill in Gdansk were swiftly taken down following the executions, and they were only ever a temporary execution platform. This method of execution and the sheer public nature of it existed in Britain centuries before, and it was considered backwards and medieval, and of course it also existed in Europe. But the aim was for the locals to see that justice was being administered, and it captured the mood and feeling inside of Poland, especially as the Nazis and the SS had slaughtered swathes of the population during World War II. The later trials which took place to execute more guards of Stutthof saw the final minutes of these criminals' lives being played out behind closed doors inside of the local city prison. This was a far cry from the public executions that occurred a year after the war. But the gallows that day constructed were colossal in size, and every one of the 200,000 people who witnessed the executions on the hill and surrounding area could not escape the sight of the former concentration camp guards of Stutthof slowly strangling to their deaths. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.